Alright, Bismillah. Let's start with doing a quick revision, I hope, for the upper GIT tract regarding the histology. Now, of course, if we're gonna start going with the starting with the histology for this video, it's gonna be starting with the oral cavity histology all the way to the esophagus. We're gonna take the stomach and duodenum in part 2, inshallah. And so we're gonna start with the oral cavity to the esophagus in that case. Tamam? Now, before we start, let's take a bit of an anatomy and physiology adding to our histology, so that it makes it easier for learning. Now, the number one is that when we go to the oral cavity, you gotta remember when food comes down to the oral cavity, it comes down in its most naked form. It's made of polymers and all that. And so your oral cavity with your teeth is to break down the food into its cellular level as much as it can, or closest to it, into basically carbohydrate, not carbohydrate, but basically tiny little bit of pieces of food with maybe some carbohydrate turned to glucose by salivary amylase enzyme secreted by your saliva. And the point is that they start to break down the food a little bit mechanically and maybe with some chemical secretion from saliva, and so that they can transport this food, let's say shawarma, into the pharynx and all the way to your esophagus till it reaches to your stomach. This is all part of the swallowing process, you could say. This is involving chewing and swallowing. So the point is was how do we, knowing their anatomy and knowing their basic physiology, how does this apply to histology? Well, you got to remember, is it logic for your lips, for instance, and for your tongue, and basically, let's say the ducts of your salivary gland, your main duct, is it logic for them to be lined with something like simple columnar epithelium, like those in the stomach and the duodenum? Of course not. They're not there to cause mainly digestion, or I guess you could say absorption. Okay, absorption. Their main goal is to break down some of the food and transport it down all the way to the beginning of your upper GIT tract. So it makes sense that the epithelium that they're lined by is going to be a durable epithelium known as stratified squamous epithelium or oral mucosa. Now, depending whether it's going to be a keratinized or non-keratinized doesn't really make much of a difference. But know it for the rest of this lecture as non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, which is a durable epithelium which protects against the abrasion of food. Abrasion is when you have like a chip and as it slides down, it starts to scratch off the mucosal surface. Yeah, that's what it's trying to protect against. Okay, so the abrasion of food with a bit of secretion of mucus, as we'll see later on. Okay, now, knowing with that idea in mind, let's continue with the oral cavity, starting with the lips. Now, your lips, Yazol, I like to use this picture. Now, your lips, they contain of three salivary structures. Just give me a minute. They consist of three not salivary structures, my bad. They consist of three covering surfaces, okay? Three covering surfaces. You got the external surface, which is, yes, it is this part, just surrounding your lips. This part, the external surface, or your skin, which is lined by keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And then you go deeper inside, you see the mucocutaneous junction. And the mucocutaneous junction, or in other words, if you read the books, vermilion zone, which is the reddish part, this is known as the mucocutaneous junction. Muco for mucus, to relate the oral mucosa, and cutaneous for skin. So we got the mucocutaneous region, which is the region in which there's a transition between the skin and the one that we're going to look into afterwards, اللي oral mucosa, your internal surface. We have to look at it from the inside. Like in this picture right here. So your skin overall has three surfaces, as we said. External surface, which is your skin, mucocutaneous junction, and the oral surface, or the junction between the surfaces, the mucocutaneous junction, okay? Now, if we're going to go internally, okay, and we're going to look at the lips, we're going to see that it has its internal surface, it's covered by an oral mucosa. And anytime you think of oral mucosa, you think of mucosa what? Epithelium and lamina propria underneath. Oral mucosa, that means the epithelium is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium and the lamina propria underneath. Okay, so epithelium here and a lamina propria underneath. And on the lamina propria of your lips contain a duct from a minor salivary gland. If you haven't noticed, or if you ever didn't know from before, we have major and minor. The major is what we took, the parotid and submandibular and all that. The minor are just little salivary glands that open into your oral cavity. One of them is called the labial salivary gland, okay? the labial salivary gland, in which it has its duct opening into the laminar propria of your oral mucosa. So another feature to keep in mind for the histology of the lips as far as I'm concerned. And where is the I guess you could say, where is the labial gland or the labial salivary gland? If this is their duct, they're found right underneath the laminar propria, right here, you could say, in the submucosa. And there's another picture that shows it, but basically they're found underneath the mucosa, on the submucosa, where they secrete saliva to ensure that your lips right here are kept wet. All right, so they're kept wet. And of course, you want to keep them where you want to drink water, right? Since the saliva is composed of 99% water, right? So prevent charred lips. So there's a couple of key features they want to keep in mind. Now, this is, of course, this picture just shows us the oral mucosa. Let's look at it as a whole. Let's take a longitudinal section to further clarify what we're talking about. Like this portion right here, this beautiful picture. Now we got, like we said, the lips are containing of 3 covering surfaces. Internally, you've got the oral surface, which is lined by a very thick, keratinized, non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Thick, non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Now, as you go internally to externally, you'll see the vermilion zone or the mucocutaneous junction, which is the region in which there's a transition between the oral mucosa and the next one we're going to link it to the external surface, اللي هي skin, which is lined by a thin, you can see the difference, thin, stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. So one is non-keratinized, one is keratinized. One is thick, one is thin. And like any other skin, it will contain hair follicles. It will contain hair follicles, sebaceous glands, salivary glands, the typical stuff that we would see under the skin, histology that is, right? And here is the one that we were talking about right here, this gland right here. So if we were to just remove these in a bit, we can see the presence of the labial gland found in the submucosa. And you can see the labial gland, they will have their ducts to secrete their saliva into the lamina propria of your what? Of your lips, or of your oral mucosa, let's say, okay? To keep your lips wet. So that's the thing to keep in mind for the histology of the lips. Here is the same thing. Thick portion, transition to the mucocutaneous junction, and then from the mucocutaneous junction, it will transition to the external surface, that is your skin. All right, with the sebaceous and sweat gland hair follicles, and some mucus secreting labial glands underneath in the submucosa. Okay, that's for the histology of the lips. Let's go to the next part.